knitters and non-knitters alike. I imagine that you were very busy finishing up projects and finding new ones to start. Today, we are going to read from Knitting Rules by Stephanie Pearl McPhee. This is put out by Story Publishing, and they gave me permission to read this out loud to you. Also, this is available on Hoopla through the library, so if you'd like to read along, you can download that and do so. Knitting Rules, Chapter 1. What is knitting and how does it get like this? If you picked up this book, I probably don't need to convince you that knitting is great. It's more than possible, however, that you could use a little help explaining to people why you do it, or why you do it so much, or why you can't stop doing it. The bare bones of knitting sound simple, and they are. Sadly, this is probably the beginning of the confusion between those regular people, known as non-knitters, and the enlightened, the extraordinary people we call knitters. Here's the whole idea of knitting. One stick holds loops of yarn, and a second stick pulls a continuous string of yarn through the loops, one by one. Row upon row is accomplished until you have a piece of knitted fabric. Non-knitters can't quite get it. You explain the basics of knitting to them, then tell them that you spend all your money and all your spare time on this pursuit, and inform them that you bitterly resent any time taken from it by ordinary activities like laundry and employment. And they look at you as if they're crazy all over you, like plaid on a Scotsman. You can show them all your yarn, though I don't recommend it, revealing the size of your stash while you're trying to convince someone you're not nuts is counterproductive. You can even make them touch and hold it, and they're still going to wonder if you're a few sheep short of a flock. Admittedly, if you think about it from the non-knitter's point of view, the statement, "I play with string for several hours a day and never tire of it," does sound as if you're touched. And that's because the bare bones of knitting is not all there is. These non-knitters haven't lived the considerable charms of knitting, or even better than that, gotten themselves a knitting lifestyle. The subtle pleasures of knitting. Non-knitters don't understand that it all starts with the simplicity of pulling one loop through another, and that at first it ain't so simple. They don't understand that there's the detail of getting the loop to sit on the needle just right, or that you can knit two together, or wrap the yarn to get more, or, horror of horrors, drop one and sit stunned, afraid that if you as much as breathe, the stitch will run away to the bottom, and you'll never ever get it picked up again. They don't know that all of this holds the key to a tiny world of genius intrigue. If you're a non-knitter who thinks what you do is clever, beautiful, and artistic, who never asks for knitted stuff but wears it with pride when you give it to him or her, and will help you carry home a whole fleece or stack of stitch dictionaries without once implying that you might want to get a grip, marry that person. Non-knitters don't know what we do, that when we first learn to knit, this sort of thing is exceedingly high drama, that the thrill of getting it right is like skydiving, except, safer, and the defeat of messing up is as nasty as losing the Boston Marathon by 10 seconds to a guy who didn't even train. How about telling them about the surprise of discovering that you aren't knitting what you thought you were? That due to some bizarre and repeated error on your part, you're making a tube top instead of socks. And despite that really big difference between these two items, you cannot for the life of you explain why. They don't understand that knitting is surprising, perplexing, and gripping. As you loop stitch after stitch through each other and make something. Pointing out to non-knitters that as far as dorky habits go, Running marathons and keeping a stamp collection are at least as pointless as knitting and don't even keep you as warm in the winter. Furthermore, it doesn't make sense to them. Furthermore, it doesn't make them think your knitting habit makes any more sense. Stick to your knitting and say nothing about rock collections or racing plastic boats. You can think it though. I would. Endless creative possibilities. Once you get the hang of knitting, you get to discover its variations. Knitting, purling, decreasing, increasing, cabling, yarn overs, intarsia, fair isle, entrelac, Estonian, Latvian. How about twined knitting? Or the mind reels and it's only the beginning. Do you do it left-handed or right? Pick or throw? Use stranding or bobbins? Wool or cotton? Circulars or straights? Use 4 or 5 double-pointed needles? Or never touch them. The techniques available to you can take a lifetime to learn, and the different ways to make these loops with sticks is engaging, clever, and not at all monotonous. Non-knitters don't understand that there's always something left to learn, and trying to tell them that there are so many extremely interesting ways to do something with string is folly. They weren't interested in the first way to do it, never mind all the ways you've read about. Non-knitters usually stop you at this point and tell you that you're out of your tree. Non-knitters usually stop you at this point and tell you that you're out of your tree. Ignore them. Knitters have it figured out. It's non-knitters, even though they outnumber us, who haven't grasped the magic. The spice of life. I used to try to show yarn to non-knitters to help them understand. The materials we knit with are the temptation themselves. There's cotton, silk, and wool, for example, and fiber has come a long way in terms of sophistication. There's organic hand-dyed cotton, Italian crepe cotton, and Egyptian cotton spun fine for tiny lace caps. The silk could be softly spun, rustic, or slubby, or a floss that's almost as fine as a silkworm spun it and painted in colors that can break your heart. If you never leave the house without your knitting, and only a house fire would make you think twice, your knitting hobby has become a lifestyle. The longtime standby, our fine friend wool, is no longer a sad, itchy wallflower at the fiber ball. She has come into her glory. You can find her hand-spun wool that's reminiscent of the sheep it left, cushy and bouncy, waiting to be warm mittens or a hat. There's thick, bulky wool for cardigans as warm as coats, and merino spun so fine for lace knitting that the name cobweb is really appropriate. Hand-painted, soft-spun, cabled, boucle, self-patterning for socks. The list goes on, and we haven't even touched the world of man-made fibers. Railroad yarn that looks like it sounds. Eyelash yarns for flutter-fletchingly, hand-wearing acrylics so durable that you could use them to knit tires for trucks. I swear, no matter how your tastes run, your hour is now. Turn me loose in a yarn shop, and I can be at the cash register in 4 minutes with Shetland for the most traditional of sweatered, or sequined rayon fun fur for a thong that a Vegas showgirl would think was over the top. It's enough to make knitters want to take off their clothes and roll around in their stash, but you can't tell that to non-knitters either. Trust me, they don't understand the urge. Not even if you show them cashmere. As stunning as it may seem to us, the non-knitters are immune. Completely immune. They can't understand where we get the time. They can't understand the compelling and fascinating difference between a 50-50 merino silk blend and the 1090 merino silk blend. They can't understand yarn as a souvenir, yarn as comfort, or knitting as intriguing. They think of knitting as both too simple and too complex. They believe they don't have the time and that we're wasting our time, that knitting is both so boring, they couldn't be bothered, and too complex and difficult for them. But they still want handmade socks. Knitting and yarn appeal to the senses. A project in the works smells good, feels good, looks good. Never feel bad about wanting it hanging around. Knitting is too beautiful to be clutter. A half-finished shawl left on the coffee table isn't a mess. It's an objet d'art. What non-knitters are missing is the personality-enhancing qualities of knitting. Knitting is a miracle worker. With knitting, people can suddenly do things they couldn't do before. They can wait in line without becoming impatient. They can sit through a grade school concert with a smile. They can handle long meetings and lectures, all without bothering other people or pacing around like lunatics. I can think of several times in my own life when knitting kept me from slapping some fool upside the head. Knitting makes boring people interesting and mundane things intriguing. The only other thing that does that has the disadvantage of giving you a hangover instead of a pair of socks. It's okay to be confused when someone tells you she could never knit because it looks complicated and, in the same breath, that it's too boring to be able to stick to it. What she means is she really doesn't want to take up knitting. An examination of the non-knitter. Non-knitters are, to me, very interesting. As knitters, it's good that we spend some time getting to understand their confusing ways. There are roughly 50 million knitters in North America. I suspect that knitting is a bit like religion many are currently not practicing. This would explain why you can always find yourself the only knitter at a cocktail party. According to my calculations, knitters, past and present, make up about 15% of the North American population. That's astounding when you think about it. It's enough for a revolution. Imagine a world run by knitters, or a cult. Cults and revolutions often end badly, however, so no matter what you're thinking, we should probably put it out of our heads. We're still fiercely outnumbered. Considering these odds, it's also pretty likely that you're going to have to marry, live with, or date a non-knitter. 5 reasons why people don't knit. Given the multitude of charms that knitting possess, why doesn't everyone knit? How come the other 85% of the world keeps looking at us like that? A brief and unscientific study, I asked some people, revealed the reasons people say they don't knit. We got the 5 reasons people don't knit. Reason 1, I could never do that. I'm completely uncoordinated. Right. Well, that's an interesting one, considering that since we've invented knitting sometime in the 14th century, it's been child labor in many parts of the world. I've got to tell you, this one does not hold water. I find it difficult to believe that children all over the world can manage to learn this, no matter how poorly educated or unskilled they are, but a full-grown person who can read, write, drive a car, and work the DVD player is unable to. Reason 2, I could never do that. I don't have the patience. I have the patience and the attention span of a 3-year-old full of chocolate bars at a birthday party. So I'm not buying this one either. Knitting grants patience to those who do it. Ask around. Most knitters will tell you they're at their most patient with needles in their hands, and that this practice makes them more tolerant of ordinary setbacks. Reason 3, I can't afford it. Nope. Real knitters, the ones who've fallen down hard and don't want to get up, would knit grass with sticks if they ran out of money. There are lots of ways to get by on the cheap. Reason 4, I'm not smart enough. Knitting. All knitting. Every single item is made up of 2 stitches, knit and purl. If you're wearing clothes and you dressed yourself, you're smart enough to knit. If you're wearing matching clothes or a coordinating accessory, you're smart enough to knit as well. Reason number 5. I don't have time. Don't start with me. We all find time for what we love to do. Just admit it. You want to cross stitch instead. There are many kinds of knitters, and not all of them seem crazy when you look at them. There are knitters who have made their hobby a lifestyle, and those who have a moderate, reasonable knitting habit that they engage into some of the time. Both kinds of knitters appear to be happy and somewhat well adjusted. Knowing which camp you fall into can help determine whether you should start planning a yarn stash for your old age. Knitting is endlessly interesting. Knitting lets you turn one thing into another, and better than that, a variety of another's. A ball of yarn could be anything at all. A hat, a book, a bag. For the love of wool, Debbie New knit a boat. It's a seaworthy too. That innocent-looking string could be anything. It's all up to you, the knitter. That's all the reading for today. Remember, you can read along with me. You can download the book from Hoopla from your library. I hope everyone is having a nice time knitting and that you've got a great stash of yarn.